My name is Mingzhen Lin. I'm the department chair of at National Taiwan University, and today my job is really simple, just to constrain the two speakers' time, each within 30 minutes, and then we will show the poster of like 10 minutes left and 5 minutes left. Okay, so our first speaker today is Professor Andrew Foster. He's a professor of economics and the director of the Population Studies and Training Center at Brown University. And he's also an editor, the editor of a Journal of Development Economics, and he's interested in long-term social and economic impact, especially in low-income countries. And today, he's going to talk about household recombination, retrospective evaluation, and educational mobility over 40 years. Let's welcome Andrew.
All right. So what I want to talk today is about, I think, something that at least was taught to me long ago, was that the basic premise that expansion in primary health care and reproductive health services leads to reductions in inequality and increased mobility. And this is something that I think was largely based on examples of places like Sri Lanka, perhaps Cuba at the time, Kerala in India, of societies that really were sort of ahead of the time in terms of these kinds of investments, and they also were ones in which there were certainly low levels of inequality. Bangladesh, I think, is an interesting contrast to that group of countries because it's sort of seen as a paradox as a place that was quite successful in terms of the provision of these basic services despite low income and a limited degree of redistributive policies such as were in place in places like Kerala and Sri Lanka. And so, the sort of simple question I'm going to ask is, how do initial local resources affect economic mobility over 2 to 3 generations during a period of rapid development in which there were changes in primary health care and reproductive services? Were there decreases in inequality? To what extent does sort of any initial advantages of households persist over a longer period of time? How do sort of larger aggregates like village affect that process? And then sort of the last point is sort of how do the process of sorting and noise affect this process of mobility? Let me just pause for a moment on that point because I think it's really central that what I'm doing is that when you think about sort of measuring economic mobility over multiple generations, it gets to be really quite complicated because you can think about there's a sort of group of people or perhaps a group of households at one point in time and their well-being, and then you can look at some households or people at some later point in time. But if you want to talk about economic mobility, you need to connect those households over time. And it's not the case that mapping is one-to-one. In fact, a given household at any origin period of time will have multiple descendants, and a household in a later period of time will have multiple antecedents. And somehow we need to keep track of that. Now, in thinking about measuring mobility, it's always nice to go back to Kuznets, and he had some things that we took seriously here. That, first of all, in thinking about income and income mobility, it's important to think about households that are grouped in family expenditure units because of sort of the role of the family and redistribution of resources. The idea that you need to work across multiple generations, and that's a hard thing to do without the right kinds of data sets, but fortunately we have, in this case, we have that. And then he made the point that even in this simple initial sketch, findings in the field of demography were used. Uncomfortable as such ventures into unfamiliar and perhaps treacherous fields, they can and should not be avoided. And so I'm not going to avoid them here. Okay? So just to sort of emphasize, what I'm going to talk a fair bit about is the process of how you deal with the process of recombination, the fact that you have a series of origin households and destination households, and you need to kind of trace them across time. How do you do that? And in particular, what are the implications if you are working with sampling data for kind of to track those households over time? And the most sort of basic fundamental problem is that if we want to make these households representative, we want to say sort of something about the population based on a sample survey, we need to perhaps deal with the fact that the weights that might be applied to a household are endogenous with respect to important aspects of behavior, such as who chose to live with whom, how many children they had, and so forth. And so a big part of what sort of emerged from this project was sort of a new way, at least for us, of thinking about this problem. Now I'm going to talk about the area of Matlab, and this is a well-known area in certain circles. It's a geographically contiguous area of Bangladesh with a population of 180,000 since 1974. What's really important for us is that in addition to a series of surveys that we've been collecting over this period, there's an ongoing demographic surveillance system. So we do have underlying background data on who lives with whom at each point in time since the early 70s. Okay, but then tied to this was a series of surveys of samples, roughly 10%, and so part of the problem is how do you go back and forth between them. So we have a series of periodic censuses with data in 74, 82, and 96. We have these large comprehensive surveys in 96 and 2014 where you really have detailed information that can be translated into questions about income and income mobility. And we have various, and the key, as I say, is that the measures of economic well-being are really only available from the surveys, not from the entire census. If we had it for the census, that would be easier. Okay, I don't need to talk a lot about this, but in fact, in doing the surveys, we were very careful about setting up a stratified sample. We did the sampling based on these sort of household groupings. We had a good reason to do that. In practice, for the questions I'm asking today, it turned out to be actually a mistake to do it that way, in the sense that it complicates things considerably at some stages, but we didn't know that at the time. Okay, but part of what makes this interesting is Matlab is an area which in the early 70s is subject to a well-known sort of health intervention. It was introduced in half the area, not others, and people have followed it, sort of followed it over time. And we did the first sort of detailed social economic survey in 1996, which is, of course, some years after that program was introduced. And so if we sort of think about it in retrospect, that was kind of the wrong way to do a program evaluation. You don't want to evaluate a program afterwards. You want to basically do a survey, introduce the program, and then look at it afterwards. But we, in fact, have a random sample that's ex post, and what we need to do is to take advantage of the data we already have and construct a sample that essentially that is random ex ante or representative ex ante based on a sample that was random at a later point in time, and that'll be clear as we go along. Okay. So one set of questions we might want to interest in when we're thinking about this issue of economic mobility, and this just, I think, emphasizes some issues that I've mentioned, is what population are we really interested in? Well, when some people think about mobility, the natural thing is to talk about populations of individuals. That is, you have a person at one particular point in time, perhaps sitting in a household of a given level of income. We can follow that same person to a later stage in life and see how they're doing. That's obviously not suitable for looking at measures of age-specific behavior like schooling. Okay, but it's a relatively easy thing to do because the processes of households forming and dissolving is not really so relevant if one's just taking one individual. One knows who the person is at the beginning and who that person is in the end. It's not really also suitable for looking at long periods of time where you might have multiple generations, and you have to think about not the same individual but that individual's descendants. So that leads to a second way of thinking about this, which people have often used, is to take the set of biological descendants. We have a father, and then we look at his sons and his daughters, and what happens to say, the sons and daughters of those. And that has a certain logic to it. There is, I think, a complication that is not always recognized, is that you can sort of think about it from an origin household. This father will have multiple sons and daughters, but at the same time, there was another household that had the wives of those sons, and therefore the sort of grandparents. And so if one's following the biological descendants, one's not keeping track of all of the antecedents of a particular descendant. One is only tracking one particular line. And that has some implications for how we think about economic mobility, particularly when there's a process of sorting across households. The other problem with biological descendants is they're kind of asynchronous. We have this nice view of our mind where we have one generation, and then there's sons and there's grandchildren. But in fact, we all know of cases where an uncle is younger than his nephew, right, where the generations are out of line. And so if you try to measure economic mobility based on biological descendant, you're inevitably run into this problem that some households will be 3 generations and others will be 2. Okay? So the way that we want to think about economic mobility, and I've already alluded to this, is to think about households in a particular region over time. And so our population will be the population living in a place at a particular point in time, and a population living in that same place at a later point in time. And then we'd like to know sort of what is the economic mobility? That is, how does the economic well-being of a household in the origin translate into the economic mobility of all the descendants from that, as well as the other way around for any given household at the end. What was the economic well-being of his antecedents? I think that this is very well adapted to what we have in this case, which is this demographic surveillance system, which sort of tracks households all the time. I think the reasons to think about a region, obviously there's a problem with only focusing on a single region, is that any people who exit from the region that are maybe affected by a program or whose mobility you want to track, you're by definition sort of losing track of them. Okay, and so this works very well if the region is quite large. If it's relatively small, you may be missing a important part of the picture. Okay. Now, the first thing we had to address using this sample, as I suggested, was we had a random sample in 1996, but we needed to create a random sample in 1974 based on the antecedents from the survey that was random. And the problem that emerges there is the set of antecedents of a random sample is not itself generally a random sample because different households have different number of descendants. Okay? And to take you through that, I want to kind of show you sort of how this problem works. We'll do it in kind of reverse from how I just described it. Imagine you have a set of households at period 1 and a set of households in period 2. In period 1, you do a random sample, and we do it the way that we actually did it in practice, which is houses were grouped in these things called baris, which are groups of households that are related in some way. So I have two baris that are outlined in the purple, and the sampling strata here would be just simply to randomly pick one of the baris, and then within each bari, pick one of the households. So the probability that household A is picked is going to be 0.167, which is a half times a third. Okay? So then we have a second set of households at time t plus k, okay? And they're going to be related to the first set of households by a series of links based on descent. So 3 people from household A sort of moved to different households. One ended up in V, one ended up in W, and one ended up in X. So there's lines describing those links. And similarly for the other households. Well, when traditionally the way that we've thought about sampling weights in panel surveys would be to say, okay, if we have household A, its sampling probability is 0.167, so its weight should be the inverse of that. Now we're going to follow each of those descendant households, V, W, and X, and we're going to say that their probability of sampling was 0.167 as well, which was the probability that their antecedent household was actually picked. Okay? What this graph shows you is that that's wrong. Okay? That in fact the probability that household V was picked is 0.5 because it also would have emerged in the sample if household D had been picked or household C had been picked, if C or B had been picked. Okay? So that if you wanted to take T plus K and make a representative sample of the cross-section, you couldn't just use the panel weights from the origin households. You would need to keep track of the probability that second household was picked, that V household was picked, based on all the potential antecedents. And the problem is, in most long-term panel surveys, you'd only have data on A, V, W, and X. You would know nothing about B, C, and D. Okay? So it would be impossible to correct the right sampling weights to create a cross-sectional sample. Okay? Now, there are various things that people have tried to do to fix them up, but most of them involve some assumptions, and they're not going to be exactly right. We have an advantage, however, is because our survey is actually set inside a demographic surveillance system, we actually know about all the links between households, and therefore we can actually reconstruct the true probabilities of sampling, and therefore for any given set of descendants, construct the accurate weights, and therefore create an antecedent sample that's representative in 1974, even though the sampling was done at some period later. Okay? So just to give you an idea of sort of how this works, what we need to do is we need to set up a series of links between each household and each subsequent and households in each subsequent group. Okay, and so we have these idea of households that are linked once or linked twice or linked a second time. So you can sort of be linked if you're linked to somebody who's linked to somebody. And then we have a little bit of math that kind of describes sort of what the data you need in order to think through this problem of representative sample weights, and therefore to link households at different points in time. The first thing that you will need is a partition in the first period. And so here we have 4 individuals who partitioned into 2 households, and a partition in the second period, which are 5 individuals that are partitioned into 3 households. Notice that the household identities are not the same, because we don't really know that a household at a given point in time is the same as one at some point in the future, the way that our data come to us. And notice that some of the people are in common between the 2, but some of them are different. Okay? So the third matrix we actually need is a matrix that tells us which people match with which other people, which people in the first generation or in the first year match with the people in the second year. So A is not the same as any of the second period people, whereas B is the same as B, and so forth. So these are the sort of matrices that we need for each period in time in order to link up our households across time. Oh, I just finished my talk. Sorry. Okay. All right. So basically what we can do is we can take those matrices and multiply them back and forth in various ways. The first thing is we can multiply the 2 matrices, the matrix by its transpose A particular in time, and that creates a matrix that describes who's living with whom. So A is living with A, and A is living with B, and so there's one household, and there's a second household. And we would have the same thing for period 2, okay? And that creates the C1 and C2 matrices. And then we can take those C1 matrices and C2 matrices and multiply by the population matrix that links people, okay? And that creates a link between the first generation of people and the second generation of people. So, for example, A is linked with B and E. As you may remember, A was the person who was alive in period 1, but not alive in the second period. So how is person A linked with person E? Well, he's linked with person E because he lived with B, and then B subsequently lived with E. And so that makes A and E linked across time through this process of co-residence. Okay? And so then if we take that LH matrix, that L matrix, and we multiply again by the household matrices before and after, we end up with a relationship that describes the 2 sets of households, which tell us the number of links between each set of households. And this is just a matter of multiplying some very large matrices. Very large because, of course, we were in practice dealing with 300,000 or 180,000 households up to 300,000 people by the late by 2014. Okay? This gives you an idea of what that matrix of household links look like when you link 1974 to 1996. It's even more complicated when you go to 2012. So this is just a piece of that matrix. And the main thing to get out of this, that in fact the world, at least in this part of Bangladesh, is very complicated. That household A, A01, has in fact 2 links, but household D01, the household, the household in 1974 called D01, actually has 10 different households with which it has subsequent links. So if you wanted to talk about income mobility of these households, you would need to say, okay, we have a household D01, what was its income? And then we need to say, well, how do we summarize the income of 10 different subsequent households? And we only know about all those 10 subsequent households because we actually have the underlying demographic surveillance systems. And the problem is that we didn't necessarily interview all of those descended households, so we're also having to correct the fact that we only sampled a set of descendants. Okay? How much difference does it make in practice? Well, it makes a difference for some variables and not others. The one that seems to matter the most is household size, perhaps not surprisingly. That if you had a relatively large household in 1974, that household was likely to have more descendants in 1996, and therefore if you did a random sample in 1996, you'd be more likely to pick up large households in 1974, so the large households would be overrepresented, and so that's basically what you sort of see here. If you don't use weights, you end up sort of overestimating average household size by about 10%. But our resampling weights, which I'll talk about in just a minute, actually mimic the full population very well. So that leads to the question, well, how do we actually construct these sample weights in order to fix this problem that one can't normally fix? Well, the idea is that the only source of randomization here is the sample that we collected in 1996. We did a random sample in 1996. So if we actually find the antecedents of those households, as I say, those antecedents are not representative of 1974, okay? But the only reason they're not representative of 74 was because of the randomization that happened in 1996. So what we can do to get sample weights for 1974 is actually redraw the sample in 1996 100,000 times, and each time figure out which households in 1974 get picked up. And then by aggregating that, we actually have what is the probability that any particular 1974 household is picked. And then if we invert that, that gives us a weight for 1974, which gives us then a representative way of constructing the 74 population, even though we did a random sample in 96. The important thing about what I just said, if you don't follow all the details, is that the things that affected the endogenous resonance choice, which is going on in the background, who chooses to live with him, who marries whom, and all those other things, don't affect the process of sampling weights except through the observable data that we actually have. So we don't need to worry about the sort of endogenous household resonance choices in constructing these sample weights. All we need to know is about the randomization that caused us to draw the sample in the first place. Okay. All right. So then, another way of thinking about this problem is to show you the distributions of a particular variable, in this case household size, using the actual population, which is the black. So that's the cumulative distribution of this variable called household size. You can also use the population weighted, which is what we get with our particular population weights. You can use a propensity score weight, which is to do something that requires a little bit less than substantially less data than we have, and it works pretty well. Okay. The blue is the unweighted. The pink is what you would get if you use the standard approach that most panel surveys actually use, which is to use the weights of the original sampled household. Okay. And the point is that those weights that people would normally use to construct a representative sample at a later period actually don't make much of a correction at all. You really have to incorporate the complexity of the links in order to get back the populations for this variable. Okay? We also do the same thing to link 96 weights to 2012 weights. And the idea here is just to construct this sort of long-term sample. Now, to give you some sense of how much this matters, here's sort of estimates of births based on the population data, which we have, and the survey data, which we also have, and then the estimates without the weights are the green, and then the black is the estimates with the blue is the black is the true, and the blue is the estimated estimates with the weights. And so the point is that using the correct weights that account for the complexity of relationships among households over time leads to a much better estimate of birth rates at each point in time. So the main point is all of this is worth your effort if you can do it. Okay? Now let me then ask the first substantive question, which is, okay, what happened from 74 to 2012 in the villages in this area of Matlab in terms of the distribution of education? So this is sort of the educational intensity of children. It gives you a sense of sort of, how much the parents were investing in the education of their child. It's a good measure of sort of consumption in these households in general, based on some data that we actually have. And then we've stratified this population by villages that had relatively high education in the beginning and villages that had relatively low education. And what you see when you look at the distribution of this educational intensity at 3 points in time is there was a big shift upwards, that education rose a lot in Bangladesh over a period. But the other thing is there really wasn't any reduction in inequality. That is to say, the inequality is roughly the same across all three measures. Okay? So you see that during this period where there was a substantial investment in primary health care and so forth, and we'll talk a little bit about the treatment program in a minute, the sort of intervention that happened. But you see that that didn't reduce inequality. That inequality was actually quite sustained over this period, despite this sort of expansion and access to primary health care that was quite good. The other thing you notice that is the initial differences between villages had largely disappeared by the last period in 2012. Okay? Okay, so I've sort of talked about the cross-sectional sampling of origin households. There's a further problem in talking mobility because once you have a representative sample of 1974, you need to measure the average status of the income of the descendants of those households. And the survey that we conducted in 96 doesn't necessarily have all of the descendants, and it doesn't necessarily have a random sample of the descendants. And so we have to essentially play the same kind of games that I've already talked about to take an unrepresented sample of the set of descendants and it turned into a representative sample. And I won't take the time to go through how this all works. But it's going to be a problem if the probability of sampling in the first place is somehow correlated with the income of the households in the second period, which turned out to be, to some extent, the case in this particular sample. To give you some sense of sort of how this simulation works, we kind of set up a world in which there were 3 states of the world, which is, imagine I have 2 descendants, okay? Y1 and Y2. In some states of the world, only Y1 is sampled. In some states of the world, Y2 is sampled. And then in other states of the world, I get both of them, okay? And obviously, if I have an equal probability of getting Y1 and Y2, then the average of whatever I observe is going to be a good measure of the average income of my descendants. But if the sampling probabilities are in some way related to Y1, we're going to get into trouble. So we ran a little simulation exercise that essentially mimics that, where the probability of sampling the first household, the second household, or both depends in part on the levels of income of those 2 households. Okay? Then to see, well, what happens if you do some kind of corrections here. Okay? And this gives you a sense of what happens as the correlation between incomes and sampling probability gets higher. Well, when you use the weighted procedure, it really, you get a good estimate regardless of what the correlation is. But if you use the unweighted estimate, things get really bad when the correlation between income and sampling probabilities tend to be related. It turns out, however, somewhat disappointingly, that in our data the correlation is right around here, where it actually doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So we did a lot of work to figure out how to do this. We implemented this. In the end, it turns out that the levels of correlation are actually at a level where it doesn't matter that much whether you weight or not. Okay? Now, there is a trade-off, however, because when you don't use weights, okay, if you look at the sort of average, the average income of the descendants, you do pretty well. You actually mismeasure each set of descendants a lot, okay? But on average, you do pretty well. Okay, so as we saw, the green curve does better in terms of measuring the average descendant, but it measures, because you're using weights, and this is something we're familiar with, anybody who's used weights, is that when you sort of make weight corrections, you're essentially privileging one household over another, and so any given estimate of a household, of the income of a household of the descendant of households is going to be wrong, but on average it's going to work out as the sample size gets large. Okay, let me then just show you some pictures of what happened in terms of economic mobility over this period. So we've divided here into low and high education villages, and this is the z-score, the educational score in 74 in standard deviations, and then that's in 96. And the first thing you see is it's kind of vertical, and it maps up nicely. Richer households or households more with higher education in the first period also had higher education 22 years later. And to some extent these curves are different, sort of reflecting this persistence between one and the other. But the other thing to see is the one standard deviation in educational difference in 74 was actually translating into about a half a standard deviation in 96. So there's some amount of mobility going on. That is, there's some sort of it's not true that some of the advantage of the richer households or the higher educational households is disappearing by 96. This shows you the picture by 2012, and now you see that a standard deviation in 74 was translating to about a quarter of a standard deviation by 96. So this would be a fairly high degree of mobility here across households. That is to say, the advantage that the higher educational households had in the early period were largely gone by 2012. It's also the case that in those households that were from villages with relatively higher education, that their advantage was also gone. Okay? So what we're seeing, what's kind of emerging from this, is a situation where inequality didn't go away over this period, but there was a fair bit of mobility in the sense that a lot of the advantage that was in place at the individual and village level was gone, by essentially the third generation. Okay. Now, one question that emerges is, well, what about the treatment comparison difference? So this is the treatment program was an intensive health and family planning program. Okay, and some work that has been done up to the 96 data sort of clearly showed that that households that were in the treatment area, that is where there was this access to family planning programs and reproductive health, but in 78, there was an advantage in terms of educational attainment, and it's pretty persistent across the distribution of households in 1974, perhaps less of an advantage among the relatively low education households in 74. Okay? But if you look at the same thing in 2012, you see that the gap between treatment comparisons is essentially gone. Okay? So what this is sort of telling us, now one thing that's important is the treatment program advantage was only in place for about 5 to 10 years, where the treatment area received very good reproductive health services and they weren't so accessible in other parts. And then they went away, and so in some sense it's not a surprise that there was some degree of convergence, but it's also a little bit surprising because we saw that by 96 there was this substantial educational advantage in the treatment area, but that advantage did not persist. Okay? And that's, that's kind of a key and interesting surprising. We thought a lot about what sort of underlies it, and I think there is an interesting sort of economic idea here, which is that when people had smaller children, they had fewer children, there was higher levels of education. But if you think about from a family perspective what the wealth of the family was, the human capital wealth was not changed. Fewer children, more human capital, the product of quantity and quality was essentially the same. Okay? So in fact, the advantage that accrued to the households in terms of education really didn't change family wealth in the third generation, and therefore there was no persistence, is one way of thinking about it. We have some evidence to support that. The other thing that we were sort of interested in is through this process of mobility, there are two things that play a role. The first is that any given household will sort of have children that are drawn from a broad distribution. That creates economic mobility. And the other thing that creates economic mobility is that households from the top of the distribution, the bottom distribution, mix up. Okay? And so we'd like to know how much of the observed convergent or observed degree of economic mobility reflects sorting versus noise is sort of generating the underlying process. Okay? So this was some sort of theoretical graphs under various assumptions where there was neither sorting nor noise, where there was a lot of sorting and a lot of noise and so forth. I won't go through all the details. But here's basically the answer. If you look at from the 74 to the 2012 period, that is the whole period from the early 1974 to 2012, you see that the sorting, that there was a small degree of sorting and there was a lot of noise. That is to say that the children of the better off households were being drawn from a very wide distribution. It wasn't very concentrated. And I think this relates to the point I was making about how the access to basic reproductive health services essentially allows greater mobility. It allows poor households perhaps to have an opportunity to do very well, to be sort of a relatively wealthy household down the road. But it doesn't guarantee anything. It just provides that kind of opportunity. When you look at just the 96 to 12 opportunity, you see that in fact there's still a great deal of noise and the degree of sorting is very high. So what's driving the income mobility, at least over the latter period, is all sort of sorting, that wealthy households are giving birth to kids that are both in the top and the bottom of the income distribution or the educational distribution at some later period. And the degree of sorting is very high. It's still the case that the kids from the wealthy households are marrying into other households are wealthy. So that the mobility is not coming from this process of sorting. It's actually coming from the fact that once kids are born, they have access to these reproductive health services in a fairly universal way in this context, and this leading to sort of a substantial range of different outcomes for their children, regardless of the wealth of their particular parents going in. So let me stop there.